This is a story buried under silence. A story of women whose bodies became battlegrounds during the world's most devastating wars.
People who were too weak or too old or too sick, who couldn't go on a forced march, were put in a basement in an infirmary and left. And that was my mother.
When cities fell and flags changed, they bore the unspeakable cost, branded as traitors, raped as spoils, erased in statistics.
Military forced Korean women into sexual slavery during World War II has been made public.
In Berlin, Budapest, Nanjing, Monte Cassino, and countless unnamed villages, women were not just victims, they were forgotten casualties of vengeance, pride, and unchecked power. Stripped of dignity, blamed, silenced. This isn't about numbers. It's about what happens when the rules of war vanish, and humanity with it. What really happened to the women during World War II? Let's find out. The price of occupation. When enemy boots marched into towns and cities across Europe and Asia during World War II, a new kind of war began. One waged not just on the battlefield, but in bedrooms, cellars, and public squares. For countless women, occupation didn't mean survival. It meant punishment, humiliation, and in far too many cases, rape. Take France, for instance. As the Nazis withdrew and the Allies returned, the French people turned on their own. An estimated 30,000 women were publicly shamed, heads shaved, clothes ripped off, dragged through the streets, accused of having romantic or sexual relationships with German soldiers. These were not legal proceedings, but mob-led acts of vengeance. Many of these women were never collaborators in any meaningful sense. They were lovers, or widows, or simply trying to survive. But for a wounded nation, punishing women became a twisted form of reclaiming honor. The movement was called épuration légale, the legal purge, but there was nothing legal about it. The real crime, it seemed, was being a woman who had lived under occupation. But things were worse, much worse, on the Eastern Front. As Soviet troops advanced westward into German-held territory, their vengeance was not limited to the military. In Berlin alone, an estimated 880,000 women were raped by Red Army soldiers. The figure is staggering, and it's not even the whole story. Victims ranged from girls as young as 8 to elderly women in their 70s. Rape was systematic, violent, and repeated. Women were often assaulted dozens of times over the course of days. Some were gang-raped in front of their families. Others were forced to drink until they passed out, only to wake up to another round of horror. Why did this happen? Some say it was revenge for Stalingrad, for Leningrad, for the 3 million Soviet prisoners of war who never returned. Others blame the dehumanizing propaganda fed to soldiers, the alcohol, the lack of command control. The reality is a brutal mix of all those factors. Soviet command gave soldiers unofficial permission to loot and ravage for 3 days upon capturing German towns. And although not every soldier participated, some tried to protect women. Some were horrified. Those who did commit these acts did so with impunity. There are stories of unimaginable horror. Entire streets of women lined up and raped. Mothers trying to poison their daughters to save them from what was coming. Young women jumping into rivers rather than face the onslaught. One anonymous German woman kept a diary, later published as A Woman in Berlin. Her writings reveal a chilling mixture of numbness and cold survival. She stopped resisting. She negotiated food in exchange for the protection of one Soviet officer, because one man's repeated rape was better than the randomness of a dozen. It wasn't just Berlin. In Vienna, in Budapest, in the villages of Poland and Czechoslovakia, similar scenes unfolded. And it wasn't just the Soviets. Other Allied forces committed atrocities too, including Moroccan and Algerian troops under French command. But more on that in the next section. Allies or tyrants? The forgotten crimes of the liberators. When people think of World War II, the Allies are often remembered as the heroes, the ones who liberated cities, defeated fascism, and restored peace. But for thousands of women in Italy, France, and parts of Germany, liberation brought no peace. It brought new terror. Looting, rape, and murder were not crimes exclusive to the Axis powers. In many places, they were committed by the very soldiers hailed as saviors. In Italy, the horror unfolded with brutal clarity during the Battle of Monte Cassino. As the Allies pushed north through the Gustav Line, Moroccan troops, known as the Goumiers, were unleashed on the villages surrounding the battlefield. These soldiers, part of the French colonial forces, committed widespread sexual violence. In the region of Lazio alone, over 2,000 women were reportedly raped. Some were girls as young as 11. Others were grandmothers. Husbands who tried to defend their families were executed on the spot. Families were forced to watch as wives and daughters were assaulted in their own homes. These acts weren't isolated. They were so extensive that the Italian press coined a term for them: Moroccanate, Moroccan deeds. The trauma left behind was so deep that, even years later, villagers spoke of the Moroccan soldiers not with hatred, but with fear, as if remembering a nightmare that never really ended. The Allied command, including American General Patton, knew what was happening. Confidential military reports acknowledged the rapes and thefts, yet little was done. Justice was rare. Silence was the rule. In Sicily, things began badly and got worse. After the Allied landings in 1943, violence against civilians escalated quickly. At Gela and Santo Pietro, American soldiers executed dozens of surrendered Italian and German soldiers. Some were shot while kneeling. Others were gunned down at point-blank range. Later, General Patton claimed they were all snipers, but reports from his own officers told a different story, one of panic, rage, and complete disregard for military law. The behavior of some French colonial troops was especially disturbing. During operations in towns like Esperia, Fondi, and Ceccano, women were raped in the streets. Others were dragged into the woods or abandoned houses. Victims included pregnant women, nuns, and even minors. Many survivors later reported contracting venereal diseases or becoming pregnant. According to one report from Italy's Directorate of Public Health, over 3,000 women in 2 provinces alone were left physically and psychologically shattered. The French command blamed the behavior on poor discipline among colonial troops, but the excuses rang hollow. Locals didn't see liberators, they saw occupiers, soldiers who acted above the law, who laughed when people cried for help, and who believed that victory entitled them to take what they wanted, including human bodies. In the aftermath, some women claimed that the Germans had been better, not because they were kind, but because they only stole gold and valuables. The Allies, by contrast, stole something far deeper. For many women, the liberation of Italy and parts of France didn't end their suffering. It only changed the uniform of the man holding the weapon. Revenge, propaganda, and the Red Army's march into hell. As the Red Army stormed westward, the ghosts of Stalingrad, Leningrad, and countless massacred Soviet villages followed close behind. Hitler's Operation Barbarossa had unleashed a war of annihilation, not just against soldiers, but against civilians. Entire Russian towns were burned, millions were killed, starved, or deported. Children were executed on arrival at extermination camps. The Nazi invasion created a deep, seething hunger for revenge that no treaty could satisfy. And Stalin knew it. In Berlin and other German cities, that revenge exploded in a way that history still struggles to confront. Rape became a weapon, a ritual, a spectacle. Soviet soldiers were told they were liberators, heroes who had defeated the beast of fascism. But many behaved like conquerors with no leash. When they entered cities, they were often given 3 days to take what they wanted: food, valuables, bodies. Some drank until they couldn't walk straight. Others laughed while lining up for their turn, with a trembling woman too weak to fight back. It wasn't just German women who suffered. Polish, Hungarian, Yugoslav, and even Russian women, previously forced laborers or prisoners, were also raped as the Red Army pushed west. In many cases, women were raped in front of their children or parents. Some were gang raped by groups of 10, 15, even 20 men, in a single night. Others were raped repeatedly for days. Some women took poison. In Berlin and other German cities, a number of mothers tried to kill their daughters to spare them the same fate. One anonymous German woman documented her experience in a diary that later became the book A Woman in Berlin. Her words are haunting. She describes a chilling decision, choosing which officer to belong to, because being raped by one man repeatedly was better than being raped by dozens. She survived by trading her body for bread, soap, and the illusion of protection. Her voice, flat and numb, reflects what thousands of others could not say. Not all Soviet soldiers joined in the violence. Some were horrified. Some tried to protect civilians, and others, especially Jewish officers who had suffered their own losses, offered compassion instead of cruelty. But they were few. Most were powerless to stop the chaos. Drunk soldiers with machine guns couldn't be reasoned with, and their commanders rarely intervened. Stalin himself reportedly dismissed reports of mass rape, saying, "Can't we understand if a soldier who has crossed thousands of kilometers and spilled blood wants to have fun with a woman?" That fun left permanent scars. Hospitals were overwhelmed by women seeking abortions. In one Berlin district alone, there were nearly 1,000 requests between July 1945 and mid-1946. Tens of thousands of babies were born as a result of rape. Many were abandoned. Others were raised by traumatized mothers who were shunned by their communities. For the Nazis, the fall of Berlin meant military defeat. But for the women of Berlin, it meant something worse, the end of hope. The conquerors had become monsters, and the price for the sins of the Reich was paid again and again in women's blood. The massacre of Nanjing, humanity lost. While Europe burned under bombs and revenge, another unspeakable horror was unfolding in the East, one that would shock even seasoned witnesses of war. In December 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army entered China's capital, Nanjing. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Over the next 6 weeks, the soldiers turned the city into a graveyard of human dignity. The Nanjing Massacre, or the Rape of Nanjing, remains one of the most horrifying yet often overlooked atrocities of the 20th century. After their victory in Shanghai, Japanese forces pressed on to Nanjing with cold efficiency. When the city fell on December 13th, it was already crumbling from within. Thousands of Chinese soldiers had discarded their uniforms and melted into the civilian population, hoping for mercy. But there was none. The Japanese command saw every Chinese body, uniformed or not, as the enemy, and the soldiers took their rage, boredom, and indoctrinated superiority out on unarmed civilians. Women were the first to suffer. An estimated 20,000 to 80,000 Chinese women were raped, but the numbers don't capture the brutality. Victims were of all ages, from girls barely old enough to walk to grandmothers too frail to resist. Pregnant women were not spared. In fact, their swollen bellies became targets. Soldiers sliced them open with bayonets, gambling on the baby's gender before spilling it out. Some women were gang-raped, then mutilated, their breasts cut off, their bodies impaled and displayed. Others were raped in front of their families before being killed. Few lived to tell what happened, but the rapes were only part of the nightmare. Tens of thousands of men were rounded up, civilians and surrendering soldiers alike. Many were used for bayonet practice. Others were tied together and shot with machine guns. Some were doused in gasoline and set on fire. Mass graves became common, filled with mutilated corpses. Families were forced to commit incest at gunpoint. Children were buried alive. Reports mention people being nailed to walls, hung by their tongues, disemboweled, or left to rot under piles of corpses. And yet, the world outside barely flinched. Only a handful of foreigners in Nanjing, including missionaries and diplomats, dared to speak out. They formed the Nanjing Safety Zone, an area meant to shelter civilians. While their efforts saved thousands, they could not stop the madness. These witnesses, some of them German citizens, were horrified. One Nazi officer even documented the slaughter and smuggled out photographs. But after the war, the narrative of victory and the politics of the Cold War buried Nanjing under layers of diplomatic silence. Unlike the Holocaust or Hiroshima, the rape of Nanjing became a forgotten horror outside of Asia. For those who survived, the trauma was lifelong. Many never spoke again. Others lived in shame, as if their suffering had stained them. To this day, the massacre remains a sensitive topic in Japan, where some still deny the extent of the atrocities. But history cannot be rewritten. Nanjing stands as a brutal reminder of what happens when war erases all traces of conscience and when women's bodies become the ultimate spoils of conquest.
Now first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously with the reach of this video. Thank you.
Silence, shame, and the legacy left behind. When the guns finally fell silent and the treaties were signed, the world called it peace. Cities began to rebuild, borders were redrawn, flags were raised in victory. But for millions of women, the war didn't end. It simply went underground, buried in silence, shame, and untreated wounds that would last for generations. Rape in wartime has always existed, and World War II was no exception. But the scale of what happened across France, Germany, Italy, China, and beyond was staggering. Yet it was rarely spoken of. Most victims never told anyone, not their husbands, not their children, not even their closest friends. To survive the war was one thing. To survive what came after, the judgment, the whispers, the rejection, was another. In Germany, women who had been raped by Soviet soldiers were often treated with suspicion. Some were blamed, as if their assault had brought shame to the nation. Others were cast aside, carrying children born of violence with no support. In some hospitals, doctors saw hundreds of women per day seeking abortions. Others came with venereal diseases and internal injuries too severe to hide. But still, they stayed silent. Speaking up meant being called a whore, or worse, a collaborator. In Italy, it was much the same. Survivors of the Moroccanate had no official recognition. For decades, their stories were dismissed or ignored. Justice was out of reach. The perpetrators, colonial soldiers from faraway lands, were either gone or shielded by military alliances. Some women were so shamed by their communities that they left their villages entirely. Others lived in isolation, never fully accepted again. In Asia, the silence was even deeper. Chinese survivors of the Nanjing massacre were often too terrified or humiliated to speak. And for the comfort women, those forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military, the trauma extended well beyond the war. Many were abducted from Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and other occupied territories. They were forced to serve in military brothels, raped daily by dozens of soldiers. When the war ended, these women were cast aside, broken, diseased, and forgotten. Many never married. Some died in poverty. A few found the courage to speak decades later, demanding apologies that never fully came. And what of justice? Trials were held, yes, at Nuremberg, in Tokyo, but rape was rarely prosecuted as a war crime. The focus was on leaders, generals, political ideologies. Women's bodies didn't fit neatly into courtroom arguments about power and responsibility. The suffering they endured was too personal, too invisible to register on the world's official record. Today, historians are slowly piecing together the untold stories. Diaries, letters, and testimonies are finally being read, not dismissed, but the scars remain, etched into generations of silence. The war ended in 1945, but for its female victims, the silence lasted far longer. They were never on the front lines. They never carried weapons. And yet, they were the ones who lost everything: their homes, their dignity, their voices. And in many ways, the world is still catching up to what really happened to them. Why we must remember. History often honors the victors, the generals, and the battles won. It remembers the speeches, the treaties, the flags raised in triumph, but rarely does it pause to remember the quiet victims, the women whose suffering never made headlines, whose pain was too uncomfortable to include in textbooks. And yet, without their stories, the true cost of World War II remains incomplete. These weren't isolated incidents. They weren't the actions of a few rogue soldiers. The mass rapes, public shaming, and sexual slavery were systematic, widespread.
The prevalence of gang rape in war is much, much higher than gang rape during peacetime.
And often tolerated, if not encouraged, by military leaders and governments. Whether it was Red Army soldiers drunk on vengeance in Berlin, Moroccan troops terrorizing Italian villagers, or Japanese officers running military brothels across Asia, the outcome was the same. Women reduced to objects of war, and then forgotten. For decades, the world looked away. Post-war priorities focused on reconstruction, political balance, and the emerging Cold War. There was no room for the discomfort of female trauma. Governments were more interested in securing alliances than holding soldiers accountable. And victims were left alone to pick up the pieces of shattered lives, often in silence. But remembering isn't about reopening wounds. It's about finally acknowledging them. The woman who scribbled her diary under Soviet occupation, the girl from Nanjing who never saw her family again, the Italian housewife raped while her husband was held at gunpoint. These are not just tragedies, they are warnings. Because every time their stories are ignored, we risk letting them happen again. Sexual violence in war is not history's exception, it's one of its ugliest patterns. From ancient empires to modern conflicts, invading armies have treated women's bodies as part of the reward, an extension of victory, a tool of humiliation, a symbol of dominance. And unless that pattern is broken, it will repeat. That's why these stories matter. They remind us that wars are never clean, that soldiers are not always heroes, that liberation for some can be devastating for others. They expose the cracks in our narratives of honor and justice, and they force us to confront the moral blindness that allows violence to be renamed as necessity or dismissed as the inevitable price of war. Today, international law has begun to recognize rape as a war crime. The work of survivors, historians, and human rights activists has pushed these stories into the light. But legal recognition doesn't erase the past. It doesn't return stolen lives or undo years of shame. What it can do, however, is honor the truth, give dignity to the silenced, and teach future generations to look harder at the human cost of conflict. Because the women who suffered during World War II were not merely victims. They were witnesses, survivors, and their memories deserve more than pity. They deserve presence. To forget them would be to repeat the mistake that let it happen in the first place. And for their sake, for all our sake, we must not forget. The weight of survival. Surviving war isn't always a triumph. For many women after World War II, survival meant carrying a silent, invisible wound. They didn't wear medals. They didn't march in victory parades. Instead, they were asked to forget, to rebuild their lives as if nothing had happened. But something had. In post-war Germany, women known as Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, helped rebuild cities from ruins. Many of them had been raped, humiliated, and abandoned. Yet they showed up every day to clear debris, feed their children, and pretend the worst was behind them. The trauma never left. Some had children born from rape. These children were often hidden, abandoned, or raised in shame. Their very existence reminded mothers of what they could never forget. In Italy and France, women accused of sleeping with enemy soldiers were punished publicly, shaved, beaten, or exiled. Many had never betrayed their country. Survival had simply meant making impossible choices, but no one wanted to understand. Once labeled, they lived with that stigma for life. Across Asia, former comfort women lived in even deeper silence. They had been abducted, forced into military brothels by the Japanese army, and raped daily.
Japanese military forced Korean women into sexual slavery during World War II has been made public.
When the war ended, most returned home with nothing. No justice, no apology, no place in society. Some lived in poverty, never married, never spoke. A few, decades later, broke their silence, trembling voices finally naming what had been done to them. The world asked these women to forget, to move on. But how do you move on when your body carries the memory, when your silence is expected and your pain unwelcome? They weren't seen as heroes, but they endured more than most. Their survival wasn't marked by glory, but by quiet strength, day after day, with no audience. And even in silence, their endurance tells a story the world still needs to hear. The truth that still echoes. As time moves forward and the last survivors fade into history, one question remains. What do we owe them? Not just the women who lived through the darkest corners of World War II, but all who have been silenced by war, rewritten by others, or erased entirely. The truth isn't just something we uncover. It's something we must carry. It would be easier to focus only on victory parades, resistance fighters, and grand strategies. But history isn't complete if it leaves out the women forced to walk naked through the streets of France, the girls of Berlin raped until they could no longer speak, or the mothers of Nanjing disemboweled in front of their families. These were not accidents of war. They were deliberate acts of dominance, often ignored or hidden by those who wrote the official stories. Even now, many of these stories remain controversial. Some governments refuse to acknowledge them. Others dismiss them as exaggerations. Survivors are still asked to prove what was done to them, as if pain must pass a test to be real. But what they endured is undeniable. The mass rapes, the forced pregnancies, the public humiliations. These were crimes committed not just by enemies, but also by supposed allies, under flags meant to symbolize freedom. To remember is not to blame entire nations. It is to acknowledge that war breaks more than buildings. It breaks lives. And women, too often, are left to pick up the pieces alone. When we speak their names, read their testimonies, and teach their stories, we're not just revisiting pain, we're refusing to let silence win. Because the truth still echoes in diaries, in broken families, in the eyes of those who survived without ever being seen. And only by listening can we truly begin to understand what war really does to the human soul. This isn't just history, it's a mirror reflecting the darkest parts of human nature we'd rather ignore. The women of World War II weren't fighters on the front lines, but they carried the weight of a war they never chose. Their suffering was not collateral damage, it was the cost of power, vengeance, and silence. And though their names may be lost, their stories remain, quiet, aching reminders of what happens when humanity disappears behind uniforms. Remembering them isn't a favor, it's a responsibility, because only by facing these truths can we ensure they're never repeated. Thank you for watching. Stay curious.